What's up, everybody? Peter X is Okafor here, and welcome to Nothing But the Funk. And today we are talking about that funky state of Ohio. Yep, Ohio. Ohio. That was how players were singing that back in the mid 70s, 75, 76. So yeah, funk is how has a unique place in the history of the funk. Let me just from the beginning throw out my my citations on YouTube for the documentaries. The first one, Funk: The Sound of Dayton. Yep. Rustling in the papers. Growing Up Funky, that's 2. 3, The Land of the Funk, Dayton. 4, How Dayton, Ohio became the capital of the funk in the 1970s and 1980s. 5, Dayton, Ohio, the land of funk. 6, the group that helped establish Dayton as the home of the funk. And that last one's about a band called Fazio, and they didn't really get big outside of Ohio, but they were that's kind of the Fazio fans in the Dayton area doing the hit, their tribute to Fazio. There's actually a Funk Hall of Fame in Dayton. So, but the funk is bigger than Dayton. So let's dive into the history here. So the Isley Brothers came out of Cincinnati in the mid 1950s, and they started off, in the pre-funk era is what I call a party band. Shout, which does, I know Ohio State was big, but I think Oregon does Shout, after the third quarter, like Wisconsin does Jump Around, but the Isley Brothers also did the original version of Twist and Shout. Now the Beatles covered that, and it was a big hit for the Beatles too. So, and the Isley Brothers, before being a funk band, they were a party band. Interesting little history, and so 2 generations of Isley. So you have that, there's sort of, as I said, that party band and sort of a popish band. And I think they were at Motown briefly, and then they started their own label, T-Neck. And then some younger Isleys came along, including Ernie Isley, who Hendrix played, was the guitarist for the Isley Brothers for a hot minute. And I think Ernie was 15 at the time, and well, he used his time wisely, and Ernie, studied under, all the time he could, and watched and studied, and Hendrix taught him, a lot of stuff. But, Ernie Isley is one of the great funk guitarists of all time. And that Ernie and the younger Isleys sort of brought in that funk element, and then of course the Isley Brothers are one of the great balladeers of the 70s and that soul funk era. So the Isley Brothers are the first aspect of the funk coming out of Ohio, and this is in Cincinnati. And then in the late 60s and early 70s, James Brown was on King Records. That was his record company, and they were headquartered out of Cincinnati. And so that's so Cincinnati is the earliest seeds of the funk. And Ohio, and of course Bootsy grew up in Cincinnati, Bootsy and Phelps, Catfish, Collins, and I think Bootsy was 17 when James fired the JBs and hired Bootsy and Phelps to be his band for about 18 months, and then I think they got fed up I don't know if they got fed up or James fired them, or who did they quit or were they fired? Who knows? But James was always hard to deal with. Bootsy's band, and was called the Houseguests, and so yeah, so that is the the story of Cincinnati, and as we do the foray in the funk. And Cleveland's, claim to fame when it comes to the funk is, the OJs and the Daz Band. And then, hopefully when I do, the fat bass and then the importance of the fat bass in the funk, I want to use the Daz Band. Give Cleveland and that part of Ohio a little love. But I mean, for the love of money, I mean, that's funky. I mean, everybody knows who the OJs are. So that's, but the meat of the funk, somehow, some way, little Dayton, produced a lot of funk bands in the 70s and early 80s. And the most important and the first one out of there was the Ohio Players. And I think I did, the 10 best songs of their catalog on Nothing But the Funk episode. And very underrated songwriters. I mean, they took in aspects, as they start breaking down songs, on, now that, YouTube doesn't take them down. I'm learning even, a lot about song structure and classic rock took a lot of the song structure from classical music. I mean, it wasn't just, verse, chorus, whatever. I mean, you had bridges and then you had interludes and outros and all that kind of stuff. And the Ohio Players and some on the sly, they took a lot of what the classic rock folks were doing and then put that in the funk. And so, and they could write hooks. I mean, but the Ohio Players are very underrated songwriters. But the Ohio Players went back. I think, they played so long. I mean, they started in the first generation of funk, with James and Sly, go through the P-Funk era, and they make it to the fat bass era, but they kind of, run out of gas, all the touring and drugs and whatnot. But the thing about it is the large majority of the fat bass funk folks were out of Dayton. So, even if they weren't, their influence is still being felt. So they went back, Zapp and Rogers out of Dayton, Lakeside's out of Dayton, Slave is out of Dayton, think Slide. And then Heatwave, part of Heatwave, I mean, you had that Dayton connection, and you also had some, the other half of Heatwave was out of England. And then when the Daz Band gets going late in the 70s, they also have, a couple of guys from Dayton and the Daz Band. So Dayton was hitting it back in the day. Why little Dayton, all this funk came out of there? Well, first of all, in the 40s and 50s, Dayton was booming. It was a little bit like Gary. Gary had steel, but Dayton, I believe, a lot of the automobile stuff was happening in Dayton. I know in northern Ohio, rubber, and tires was big, in Akron and in Toledo and those places. So, but the other thing is they really took, the Dayton Public Schools took music classes seriously, and they had a program. They really utilized a free federal program where free instruments, music instruments for poor folks. And so Dayton Public Schools really, really hit that hard and doubled down on that. Now, and it paid, dividends, in the 70s with a jumping music scene. Obviously, Dayton was very segregated in the 1960s, race riots in 1966, but the high school scene was very competitive, and they had a lot of the battle of the bands. And as I said, let's take it to the stage. I mean, hip hop, you battle on record, and then in the funk you battle on the stage, and then that starts. Dayton got into that early on. They were Dayton. They didn't leave Dayton once they did well on the charts, and there wasn't a lot of flash and stuff. I mean, Dayton was pretty. The music scene was pretty down to earth there. But in the 70s and 80s, the factory started leaving. That's probably why the funk did rise. It was just like hip hop rose and came out of the poor areas in New York City. I mean, it was the same thing for Dayton. Another important thing, in the late 70s, I mean, George Clinton and Bootsy helped zap Roger Troutman zap Roger, and then they also, helped folks, come out of Dayton in the late 70s and early 80s. So, so it was a good system of reaching back, started with the Ohio players, and then the Troutman family did it. Yeah, so yeah, this is why Dayton became Dayton, and the funk rose out. And finally, Dayton did have some local record companies, and they did some, they released singles locally, and then they would be, picked up by bigger labels, and the radio DJs would support the local music, the local funk. So WDAO was the big funk radio station, in Dayton. Here's an interesting number. So in the 70s, 16 groups came out of Dayton, and they had 110 charted singles. That's Dayton alone. And so obviously it was the black singles charts. But that's a pretty, and a good chunk of that is, Zap, Lakeside, Roger, and Slave. But, pretty good track record there. And so I lived in Columbus, in the late 70s and early 80s. So just by osmosis, I was affected by the funk and the fat bass, because the fat bass is prominent in my, I just, always have loved the fat bass, and, but that's what, the funk was in middle school. And Columbus, Ohio, I mean, in between, Cleveland, Dayton, and Cincinnati. So we got bombarded with the funk, and so, I became a funk addict, whether I liked it or not. But yeah, it's still in my music, and glad I was in, at the epicenter of funk, in the fat bass era in the late 70s. So anyway, thank you for coming through. I have 6 albums of my own. I record under the name Exodus, Xodus. My first album is called Book 1. 6 albums on all the major streaming services, and I also write science fiction, fantasy. I have 2 novels and novella on Amazon, and I write under the name Peter Exodus O'Coffer. So thank you again for coming through, and I will see you next episode.